Okay, so what we're looking at is Eisenhower and kind of domestic politics. We talked a lot about the foreign policy stuff. And so Eisenhower, and we've talked about this before, he's a lot different than modern Republicans. He favored the business community with tax cuts. He opposed a lot of kind of federal intervention in healthcare, education, even racial stuff. Um, but he did not want to get rid of New Deal programs. He thought that a lot of them were effective and that they should have a place in politics. Now, what we're seeing is this idea of kind of modern republicanism, where you're kind of maintaining almost like the social welfare course plotted by Roosevelt and Truman, but then in terms of other things like healthcare, race relations, very much kind of non-interventionism. And so Eisenhower is going to be kind of the embodiment of this kind of middle path. Um, the other thing is that he felt that states should basically kind of make the decisions for themselves. That if states wanted to implement policies on race, if they wanted to segregate or desegregate, he said that should be up to a state, not the federal government. He also felt that economic decisions should be left up to private businesses. And the perfect example of this is nuclear power. And nuclear power, was kind of starting to gain traction in the 1950s. And it's a kind of just one of the perfect examples of how Eisenhower felt that basically nuclear power should be self-regulated, that the government shouldn't really step in and make decisions on this, and that private energy companies should be the ones to kind of make a call, based on their facilities and that sort of thing. Um, Under his administration, though, we do see the welfare state grow. Federal government is going to take on new projects. You're also going to see that Eisenhower is going to sign a series of laws where he's going to bring almost 10 million more workers into the Social Security system. He will increase the minimum wage. He's going to continue the federal government's role in public housing. There will be a new Department of Health, Education, and Welfare that will kind of be started under him. And the other thing, too, is when there is a big polio outbreak, Eisenhower is going to get Congress to fund vaccinations for people, even though a lot of conservatives said, well, this is the state's responsibility. So once again, Eisenhower is kind of treading in the middle there. He has elements of kind of the liberal ideology and then elements of this kind of conservative ideology. Probably one of his biggest domestic projects, and we talked about this a little bit in class, was the Interstate Highway and Defense Act of 1956. And this, of course, was done mainly for national defense purposes, so that way we could move, troops and things across the country very quickly if needed. But it was also really important for economic growth. The federal government paid most of the costs through this thing. There's going to be increased fuel and vehicle taxes that will pay for this new road. But for Americans, now they can hop in their car, they can drive across the country on these new roads. And of course, right next to the roads, you're going to have the growth of kind of fast food industries, motels. So it's also going to kind of create other economic businesses and things like that people would be able to take advantage of. Okay, the other thing that happens domestically under Eisenhower is a new Indian policy. So what he's going to do is we had seen under FDR, there was kind of this like reversal of strengthening tribal governments, preserving Indian culture. And, FDR had in a way been kind of trying to backtrack from the Dawes Act. He didn't want to strip away tribal culture. He didn't want to break up the lands. He wanted to actually try and give it back to them and kind of give them a little bit more autonomy. Um, Eisenhower's administration is going to have a little bit different approach. They have a three-part program, and it'll be compensation, termination, and relocation. And the idea behind this is that um, what they would do is compensation would be they would pretty much pay Indians for kind of the land claims that had been taken by the government. And so they would basically pay you based on land values. The problem was they were paying you based on land values of the time that the land was taken. And so if the value had increased, you weren't getting paid that increased amount. The other problem, of course, is there was no interest included on this. So a lot of the compensation is going to be well under probably what it should have been. The second part of this was termination. And this was actually, this started under the Truman administration, but kind of continued under Eisenhower. And what this did was it transferred jurisdiction of tribal land to state and local governments. And so it ended that kind of relationship between Indians and the federal government, which meant that, you know, if you had federal hospitals, schools, any other federal organizations on tribal land, now these things were gone. And of course, as we've talked about, um, you know, from the Dawes Act in 1887, most of these tribes had become fairly reliant on the federal government. Well, now with the federal government kind of terminating that relationship, a lot of these people are actually going to be worse off from this termination. The last part is relocation. And relocation, basically, it was a program that started in 1948, and it'll go until about 1973. And the government encouraged Indians to move out of the reservations into cities. And what the government would do is they would provide them with a one-way bus ticket to get to the city. And then once you got into the city, there were location centers. And these would help with housing, job training, medical care, anything to try and get these people almost like integrated into the cities. Um, the problem with this was that it was very difficult to return home if things didn't work out because the government sent these people, I mean, fairly far away. So, for instance, in your book, they talk about the Sioux who are in South Dakota. They send them all the way to California. And Alaskan natives get sent all the way to Chicago. And so what happens is almost one third of these people who are relocated, they just try to get back home and they actually leave. When they get to the cities, of course, they end up fighting kind of discrimination and racism and things like that. And a lot of the people end up kind of almost in like these Indian like slum tenements in the cities. And so the policy of compensation, termination, relocation doesn't really end up helping them that much. Okay, 1956. What's happening here is, for the most part, um, things are fairly peaceful. The economy is doing very well. Eisenhower easily defeats Adlai Stevenson, who was running for the Democratic Party. Democrats do keep control of Congress, but by the time midterms roll around, like 2 years later, the Republican Party gains a majority in the Senate and an advantage in the House. Um, and so Eisenhower, for the most part, a lot of people like him. You know, he got them out of Korea. So far, he's kept American troops from getting involved pretty much anywhere else in a major combat. The economy still seems to be booming. Um, Eisenhower is going to kind of keep the government together in terms of like Republican unity and even working across with Democrats. Um, they are going to enact a civil rights legislation, and it's going to be more symbolic as opposed to actually doing anything. Um, but what you're going to see too in the second term is that the economy is going to be starting. We're going to start to see it start to slide a little bit, and we're going to start to see a recession kind of on the rise. And so Eisenhower is really going to have to work hard to kind of fight against this kind of growing recession in the economy. But once again, for the most part, Eisenhower is going to keep inflation low. There will be two pretty serious recessions that'll happen under his term, and he'll be able to work through both of them for the most part. Um, but as stated, in terms of civil rights, minorities, things like that, there's still a lot of work to do, and Eisenhower is simply just not going to get to it.